descendant of English and Irish people who came to Quebec and Ontario. And I've always, well, since I was a teenager, I think I've been struggling with this, the tension between these stories that we tell ourselves as Canadians and the history of colonization that I learned about and am still learning about. So I'm sort of struggling with that, our history, and so I'm drawn to these issues of how we live together on this land. Are you guys going to talk about yourself? Here.
Good job. Yeah. Hi, I'm Sylvia Moore. My family's Mi'kmaq. I'm from Keswick, which is southwest Nova Scotia. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I always bring that to anytime I talk about myself, because in the Indigenous world, it's really important to be looking 7 generations hence. And so therefore, all the work I do is always a reflection of my values and my concerns for my children, my grandchildren, and so on down the line.
I'm Amy Hudson. I'm originally from Procter. It's on, most people here probably know, it's on the southeast coast of Labrador. And for the last few years, I guess, I've been doing work with and for my home community in different capacities, and for various communities in the territory of NunatuKavut, and so that's so I'm a part of this research as both a researcher and a participant voice as well.
So we've been working together. The 3 of us have been working together, and we've been writing together, and it's a really interesting dynamic, I think, of working actually really, trying to write something with 2 other people is it's a really good learning experience, I think, for all of us, because you all of a sudden realize the assumptions that you're making are not the same as somebody else's, and so we're really learning, I think, a lot with this, both the research and then writing together. So we're going to talk today about the research we've been doing, and we've divided it into 3 parts, and I think each part too will our own perspective and our own self will come through with that. So Indigenous women have often been silenced in the dominant sort of historical narratives that we tell ourselves, that have been told about certain regions. And so Indigenous women have been often sort of erased, or their existence has been diminished. In NunatuKavut, in the southern Labrador region, the settler colonial narratives have framed historical Inuit women as sort of the last of the dying race, in an effort to legitimize colonial exploitation and ownership of the land. And so this paper, this work that we've been doing, explores this gendered and this racialized narrative about this region. So and when we talk about this dominant historical narrative, we're talking about the books that have been written, the discourse that has been created historically over the years, and a lot of it, most of it, was written or was told by European men. So you can think of Cartwright, the Moravians, who have been the people who told the Labrador story, really, the Hudson Bay traders, other missionaries, all coming from a certain perspective, all coming from a very male perspective and interested in certain things, and didn't have the access to women's lives or to women's stories. Obviously there was a rich oral history that women in this area had created, had formed, this culture that had formed, but the men who were publicizing their own narratives of this region didn't have access to the women's stories. And so their women are largely absent from these records. So in the early to mid 1700s, Inuit lived throughout the coast, and Europeans were very interested in the fishing industry there. Well, everywhere, but especially in the south. But there was a lot of violence between Inuit and Europeans, and the Europeans couldn't really get a stronghold. They couldn't get as much control over the fishery as they wanted. So they worked with, well, first of all, I guess they signed a treaty with the Inuit in 1765. Governor Palliser signed this treaty, and he also worked with the Moravians to try and contain the Inuit in the northern part of Labrador. So Governor Palliser recommended that the missionaries establish, and here's a quote, "a trucking place where these savages may be stopped from coming further southward, and we may procure what we want of them, and thus keep the rest of the coast open and free for our adventurers." So there's a very economic reason for these processes that the governor wanted to have happen, and to have the Moravians come in and have land grants in northern Labrador. So in 1771, the Moravians established a mission post at Nain, and they eventually had land grants throughout, well, a couple of land grants on the north coast of Labrador. And the Moravians were very adept at publicizing their work, and because they had a large public, they were funded by people throughout the global world. They really wanted, it was very important for them that they put forth a certain story, a certain narrative about what was going on. So they were very adept at telling the story that only true Inuit lived on the north coast of Labrador. Only true Inuit lived, more specifically, within their mission posts, within these land grants that they were given. So they told this story because they needed to have that legitimacy, I guess, to have the public support, like the broader global public support and the funding. So they framed their stories in a very specific way. And they used what historian James Hiller describes as a containment policy to try and contain Inuit in the northern part of Labrador. Of course, this didn't work, and this wasn't a success, but when they're telling the story, they can tell it how they want to tell it. So, so throughout the 1800s, European fishermen came from Europe and the United States and fished for cod along the Labrador coast. Some married local Inuit women and had families. Hudson Bay Company servants married Inuit women and had families. But again, the story of those marriages often tends to be, well, as one anthropologist wrote in 1966, quote, "It appears that most of the white men who first settled down on the coast took Eskimo wives. There were no other women to be found in the land at this time." End of quote. So instead of recognizing these Inuit women, these wives, as invaluable partners and teachers and mediators and connector work that existed in Labrador at that time, they're framed as, well, that's the only choice. So, you know. But Lydia Campbell, though, in her writing in 1894, she sort of echoes this this disdain of Inuit wives. She said, but she gives it her own spin too. So she describes how her mother was spotted by some white men. Going ashore, they found my dear good mother and carried her off, as there is no other kind of woman to marry here. The few English men each took a wife of the sort, and they were never sorry that they took them, for they was great workers, and so it came to pass that I was one of the youngsters of them. And that quote actually, interestingly, was published in the original newspaper, but it wasn't published in the them days version of it. So, so there's that narrative of, well, sort of last choice women, but as she says, they were actually invaluable for these European men who relied on their skills and their social network and that sort of thing. So the Moravians, in telling their story from the North Coast, use certain characteristics of what they consider to be what characteristics would, how do you say it? They would characterize Inuit in a certain way and use these characteristics as reasons to demonstrate that other women, other people in southern Labrador or wherever were not Inuit. And so they did this because they wanted to legitimize their own work in northern Labrador. And they helped to create, in doing this, they helped to create a narrative that is echoed back and forth. You see it in various historical documents and books, even into the 1960s, that there are no Inuit in the southern part of Labrador anymore. So this narrative that the Moravians had been creating and telling over and over again gets echoed and echoed throughout the literature. So the story of the families of these Inuit women therefore becomes a very gendered story. And the women's roles in creating a society, in encompassing outsiders into their own society, becomes diminished. The story of that becomes diminished or minimized. So if we can look at this sort of situation within the literature, within women's history literature, elsewhere in Canada, and sort of compare what's going on to what other historians have looked at elsewhere. And in the prairies and in central Canada, there's been a lot of work actually done on this sort of thing and trying to bring out the women's history and the roles of Indigenous women in that history. As Kirsten Burdett says, and she's actually from, she's of Southern Inuit ancestry, but she works in the prairies. She says, obscuring Indigenous women from the history of the West helped legitimize European Canadian settlement and made the presence of Indigenous women seem out of place or unnatural. This effacement of Aboriginal women was central to the construction of an imagined white settler society premised solely upon European Canadian values and beliefs. So when settlers come to stay, as Patrick Wolf says, they tend to use this logic of elimination, which is the story that, well, Indigenous people are not here, so therefore settlers have the authority and the legitimacy to settle on and own and take over lands. And that is legitimate because, well, Indigenous people are no longer existent. And they do that either by, genocide and physical violence, or by telling stories that make people invisible, that make the indigeneity of people disappear. So, well, if they're not Indigenous anymore, they have no more right to the land than we do, right? Like that's the story that that is so prevalent in settler colonialism, and that's repeated over and over again. So Sylvia is a researcher, a historian who's done a lot of work on the fur trade, and again, looking at the role of Indigenous women in the fur trade. And she, again, the story is often that Indigenous, well, the story was never really about Indigenous women within the dominant historical narrative, but she's looked more closely into the role of women in the fur trade, and shows how intermarriage between Indigenous women and European settlers or European traders changed through time. So in the early days of the fur trade, and this is in central Canada and the West, so in the early days, intermarriage was seen as alliance making. So Europeans would marry Indigenous women in order to gain access to the social networks that were there, because if they wanted to trade, they needed access to these family groups that existed there. So it was seen by Europeans as a step up, a step into the existing society. And of course, these connections, as in Labrador, were essential to people's survival. If you wanted to survive on the land, you needed somebody to show you how, right? And later on, European fur traders started to see women of mixed ancestry as the ideal mates, and that existed for a while. And Indigenous women lost much of their ability to control kinship ties, and European women were seen as the ideal mate. So this changed throughout time in her research in the fur trade of central Canada. So this is the sort of context of the work that we've been doing in NunatuKavut. So in order to challenge the historical narratives that I talked about in the beginning, we want to look at how gender and how race and how colonialism have all intertwined in NunatuKavut. And we need to consider the power relations in how historians write history, and to create space for the diversity of voices and the diversity of experiences. So I'll let Sylvia take over from that.
Hi, so given all this, the three of us worked together, had lots of conversations, and decided what we would do, how we might approach research and working with women on the South Coast. So one of the things I do is work in Indigenous research methodology. So looking at moving away from the traditional academic view of research and moving into an idea of research is really about finding new knowledge for and with Indigenous people to meet their needs, not the needs of the people who are doing the research, but rather what is it that the Indigenous communities might tell us that they need? How is it that they want to go about finding out these things? Right? So the strategies, it's about them, it's not about the researchers. And the idea that we're looking for some sort of knowledge. One of my favorite ways of getting involved in research is through narrative. I think in mainstream we often see narrative as someone telling a story about their lives or someone else's life. And in some ways it's often devalued or not seen as quite as rigorous as other sorts of searching for knowledge. In an Indigenous worldview, if I can be that general. It's very much about the subjective experiences in the world. So it's all right if elders tell us that they've had such and such an experience, because that's their experience. And we give validity to that and legitimacy to that, and know that whatever knowledge they've brought from their own personal experiences, that's something to be valued. And so narrative works within that and says, whatever people are telling us about their lives, there's value in that, and how is it that can help move us forward in terms of whatever new knowledge is being sought. Storytelling and narrative is also part of Indigenous worldview, that it is about stories, and that story holds culture, it holds history, oral traditions. And Thomas King says that that's all we are. We're stories. That's what life is about. So we thought about that and then said, how can we begin to tell these stories, and how can we work with the women in the communities and with NunatuKavut Community Council to move forward and begin to look at these stories. Now, in mainstream, you might hear researchers talk about collecting stories, but again, that makes it seem as if the researchers are going in and getting for themselves. So we didn't think about collecting stories. We thought about listening to stories and providing space for women to tell stories if they chose to do that. And so how did we approach that? We did three things. One was we set up some focus groups and invited women if they wanted to come to those. Those were on the South Coast, and there were open-ended questions that encouraged conversation. We also had some smaller groups, perhaps just of 1 or 2 people, if they couldn't make it to the focus group, if they wanted to meet with us in another way, and so on, and so that was available for people. And the third thing we did was that we set up workshops. That was in June of last year. We had 2-day workshops. In Goose Bay invited women to come to it, and the workshop over 2 days had all sorts of components to it. People giving presentations on how story is contained in photos, how stories are held in objects or artifacts of some sort, and women were invited to bring photos or bring objects from their families or from their lives. And food. Yes, and we had food there, and that was always great. And the other thing was that we had handcraft sessions, so women were making sealskin bracelets and so on. So that's what we focused in on, and decided that we were going to pursue that, as I said, not to gather people's stories, but to provide that space and the listening. So this isn't a photo from that session per se, but that's what it would have looked like, is women gathered around doing some kind of handcrafts and sharing conversation. So there were 2 main parts from those sessions that I think are particularly important for us to talk about and to think about. One is the importance of listening, and the other one is the importance of the dynamics. So in terms of listening, asking people or providing them the opportunity to share their stories, especially in this context of a history that hasn't been told, it's important to listen, and not just listen, but to listen deeply and to listen respectfully to what it is that women are saying and the meaning that that has for them, not to put our own values or meaning or understanding on them. And giving women that opportunity for their voices to be heard. And of course, voices aren't heard unless somebody's listening. They go together. And the other thing was the dynamics. As I said, in the focus groups, for example, there were questions that would just help facilitate conversation. And what we noticed is that there was some hesitancy to speak, and then once women started speaking, then more people would start speaking. And it just had that sort of energy that fed on itself, where maybe we hoped that the environment felt safe and it felt like an okay place. One woman said that she was sharing things that she hadn't shared before because she didn't know if it was okay. So that kind of idea that it became a place and an opportunity to talk about things that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. And some women told us that they came to the focus groups or these other gatherings because they knew it would be a place to share stories. And so it was really great that that was happening. So in mainstream research, we often hear a lot of times about how stories are analyzed and what is it that's come out of those stories. But rather than doing that, we just thought that we would look at what were some of the main themes that we noticed or threads. And so if you think of the idea of sweetgrass and how you take all those separate pieces of sweetgrass and start to braid them together and weave them together, then to me it was a similar kind of thing. What are all those little pieces of stories that we're hearing, and how do they start to clump together and weave together to help to inform the narrative of women on the south coast of Labrador? So there were two main pieces, two main threads that came out of the stories that we heard. One was stories of the land and the sea. Women talked about gathering food, such as berry picking and fishing. And berry picking, for sure, is an example of knowledge and skill that represents a particular place. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm from Nova Scotia. I didn't know about red berries until I got here. I don't really know where to go and find red berries. I have to go and ask someone. But if people would come to Nova Scotia, in an area where I'm from, then I know where to go and find the blueberries and blackberries and when they're going to be ripe and so on. We noticed that women were talking a lot about berry picking. Another thing they talked about in terms of the land was traveling on the land and having seasonal homes. Really interesting, that idea that there are summer homes out of the main communities, and people still go to those. They're very much considered part of their lives and who they are, and part of their family and their history, their personal histories. And there were some who talked about being in town because it was important that children go to school, or that maybe that's where there was employment and so on, but on the weekends and in the summer and so on, going back out to these, to their other homes. Some people talked about cultural continuity and that really comes from being on the land and being by the sea and having a lifestyle that continues on, very similar to what your grandmothers would have had and your mothers would have had and so on. But it was focused on place. People were talking about particular places. They talked about the land and their relationship to it. They spoke about knowing particular trails, islands, shoals. One woman was talking about the fact that one family member always took her out on a particular island berry picking, and when that person couldn't one summer, somebody else did, but he didn't know where the shoals were for the boats and so on, and sort of the events that unfolded from there. But it was very interesting to know that, or to hear people talk about, you have to know where these places are because that's what it means to live in that place. They talked about knowing a place well enough to be able to get yourself around, and that if you move outside of your community or the area that you know well, then you might have a hard time finding your way around somewhere else. You don't know the trails or how to get from one place to the other, or what those parts of the land are, that it's really difficult to navigate new places. We heard some conversation about feeling trapped in a community or in a town, and when you can't get out onto the land, and the sense of being out there, sense of freedom, being out on the land. And the other stories we heard were about people and community. So one was the land and the sea, and women's personal stories about their lives as they connect to that place. The other one was connected to people, whether they be family or within community in general. They spoke about being belonging and have a sense of belonging to a specific community of origin, or in a community that they now live in, if it's not the one that they necessarily grew up in. They talked about learning from stories and from the teachings of parents, other family members, people who live in the same place as they do. And some talking about stories, 2 or 3 people might talk about the fact that they were all from one particular community, and that the stories that they were telling would only be understood by the people from that community. You have to be from there to understand. They talked about knowing stories and understanding those stories as linking them to that sense of place and that sense of belonging, because they knew the stories, the people, the community, the land, and the sea. That's where they belong. That's who they are. In terms of their connection to people and community, the women also talked about some of the roles that they had, such as raising children, cooking, laundry, many stories about hanging clothes out on the line, bringing them in when they're frozen in the winter, and so on. And I related to those stories because those are some of the ones from my own personal history as well. Handcrafts, learning to sew and knit and so on, and doing that as part of a responsibility. Sharing food with family and with community, and visiting. Those were all things they talked about in terms of their own lives, experiences they've had, what's important to them, what their lives have been about. I think that's it.
Okay, so what I'm going to be sharing with you are some of the lessons learned from this work, as well as situating some of the findings of this research in the context of Southern Inuit culture and colonial society. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about storytelling as cultural survival. As we've heard, storytelling serves many purposes, not the least of which is education. So storytelling is a form of education, from everything from cooking, as Sylvia has mentioned, to survival. And I thought this would be an interesting picture. It's a woman scraping sealskin, obviously, but I'm sure there are a lot of people in this room that can relate to having heard lots and various stories of how important it was to clean the sealskin right so that it could be utilized to in all the various ways that it needs to be utilized, and getting it the right texture and chewing it. I remember those stories and some funny stories about that, and false teeth of female elders in my community, and trying to get the sealskin just right. So I thought that would be an interesting picture there. So the women that participated and helped us with this research explained that storytelling is a vital part of informing the knowledge base for future generations, and that this knowledge base would include the skills that are necessary to survive on the land, to navigate the land and live in harsh climates, and to be able to provide for your family on the land. They expressed the importance of sharing stories with each other and with children and youth as necessary. It was also interesting to note that the women were less inclined to talk about themselves directly, and instead shared stories that reflected strong community and kinship ties. So the way that all parts of the community and all social networks were interconnected and valued was demonstrated. They talked about how a shared connection to the land as a result of having lived upon the land together in a particular community meant that people should and could equally avail of resources like, for example, salmon. They pointed out that in some cases this was not always the case, especially in communities where there would be both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, with NunatuKavut members accessing salmon tanks. It's always a dynamic issue in our communities. Nonetheless, the sense of community was evident. For one group of women, they spoke about, in speaking about political identity, they referred to their community athletic team's color, and that was in fact what tied them together as a community, and it was what they chose as an identifier in talking about who they are. So the point is that the women discussed storytelling, and the way they told their stories was really inclusive, and it really was about, it was a method of transmitting stories to procure cultural survival. Women's responses and reactions to questions of identity reflected the totality of human life as well. Again, reinforcing that all parts of community life are interconnected. At this same time, the research team also understood that the women were often expressing modesty in their unwillingness to discuss themselves directly. And we thought this was really interesting because there are other scholars who note that in Inuit society, women tend to draw away from drawing any attention to themselves, and very careful that they're not sounding arrogant and boastful in their conversations. Instead, the women that were teaching us stories told us about themselves in a way that reflected their childhood and that of the stories they've heard from their mother and their grandmother and so forth. So this is a picture of my community in the winter. I took this photo maybe a month ago when I was home. So in reflecting on the women's stories and reflecting further on, Southern Inuit culture as we're learning from the women themselves and the effects of colonialism, we can see that the colonial mentality has been very active in interpreting and creating perceptions of culture, both externally and internally. And this is what Andrea was speaking to earlier in providing context. So one of the goals of this work was really to build understandings and awareness of Southern Inuit cultures from the women themselves. So in doing this work and learning from the women, we were more attuned to the way that these external interpretations and perceptions of culture have been informed by colonial interpretations of indigeneity. So it was helpful in understanding the depth to which this colonial knowledge base inaccurately reflected who these people are and were. To some degree, the Southern Inuit, and not unlike other Indigenous peoples in Canada, have been forced into a game of colonial recognition politics that has impacted self-identification and external interpretations. And this is significant because when Indigenous people like Southern Inuit recognize and understand themselves in relation to the land and in relation to the water and in relation to their community and the people around them, but then they're expected to adapt to and accept changing political labels that purport to tell them who they are. And this becomes very stressful and very, very confusing and very foreign. So it comes as no surprise to us when thinking about all this and contextualizing it, that when speaking with the women, they were much less inclined to talk or speak to culture in ways that use labels to identify them. And they always came back to talking about who they were in relation to their community. And I should note as well that it sounds as though in talking about this subject, it sounds very odd to me as a third party and somewhat detached. But like I said, I'm involved in this as both a research participant and a researcher. So in fact, the expectation that individuals self-identify at all, to even choose a label, is entrenched in colonialism, and as a consequence of the depth to which colonial interpretations and perceptions of indigeneity have come to dominate mainstream discussions of indigeneity. So there's no doubt that identity struggles and confusions exist and perhaps are exacerbated by the introduction of these terms and the expectation, that individuals have to pick a label in order to be revered as authentically Indigenous. But what was really inspiring in talking and listening to the women, and what really remains remarkable when you think about it, is that despite all of the pressures to exist and to identify in ways that reflect colonial standards of indigeneity, the women refused to do this. They moved beyond colonial parameters of recognition and ideas of culture, and really grounded who they are and who they were in their everyday realities. So, in further understanding this work, we thought it was important to situate the assimilative approach of government in its attempts to erase indigeneity from the south coast of Labrador via industrialization, a wage labor economy, and an education system that overwhelmingly seems to fail in validating Indigenous history and culture. So this colonial reality has implications for the way that Indigenous people and the women who informed our discussions understand the colonial history and the colonial reality in which they and we live. Yet, even though attempts to erase and oppress an Indigenous people are part of their reality, the Indigenous strengths and values manifested themselves in ways that actually prevent this from happening. The fact that they've been participating willingly and actively in this with us is just one very small example of that. And I want to read a quote by a Mi'kmaq scholar, Benita Lawrence, that I think resonates a lot with Southern Inuit experience. And she says, "Our generation in my family now lives with the repercussions of having been brought up to consider our native heritage at very deep levels to be meaningless, and yet, like a tough weed whose roots are pervasively anchored everywhere in the soil of this land, and which therefore cannot be uprooted, our native identity continues to manifest its presence in my family, even after a generation of silencing." And I just think that's such a powerful quote that really exemplifies, I know it exemplifies my reality as an Indigenous woman from a particular community, and from the stories that we've heard from the women and the stories they've shared. I just think it really does justice and reflects those experiences. So while colonization has indeed had its negative impacts, colonial society has not yet defeated the Indigenous histories and people of the land. And one way of disrupting these dominant colonial narratives is to engage in culture narratives, which is kind of the point of our research. So this is a picture of myself and my daughter, Kea, a few years ago, dog sledding in Goose Bay. So to sum up, the themes that Sylvia spoke to, and the way I guess we analyze, or did not, and I'm still learning, did not analyze the data, but the themes that were discussed were evident and permeated all of the discussions with the women. And they point to the way in which Southern Inuit life and culture is understood and perceived and contextualized by the women themselves in NunatuKavut communities. The way that the women articulated their everyday lives and that of the people before them in their communities is central to understanding Southern Inuit culture. So that's sort of the point of this, right? It's not, what we're trying to demonstrate is that we're understanding culture through the voices of women who have otherwise and previously and historically been marginalized from the conversation. And so we've lost a large knowledge base in transmission. And the significance of the women's relationship to the land and their articulation of the importance of storytelling for children and youth reveal who they were and are as an Indigenous people. The relationship to the land and to water is necessary for survival, for physical survival, emotional, mental, and social. Reveal the connection to the land and just the deep rootedness of belonging to the land and to the people that were there before them. Very interestingly, not surprisingly, the women described a sense of belonging to the land that was articulated with a sense of pride and privilege that I don't think it can actually be written. It can't be expressed that way. At least that's how I understood it, and I understood that because as an Indigenous woman from my community, I know how important that is and how significant it is to understand who you are in relation to not just the people in your community, but everything around you, your environment in that community and how that shapes you. And that's certainly a theme that came out in our discussions with the women. The way the women acted as storytellers during our conversations demonstrated the way all parts of the community were interconnected. And the way that the women refrained from acting as sole authors in conversations was really interesting. Women always, I don't think there was a case where they did not, they always deferred to other women in the room to elaborate on the story or to weigh in or to provide deeper context. And this was a very integrative storytelling technique and again revealed the necessity of the entire community in everyday life. A sense of community solidarity and togetherness described the ways in which the women spoke of their connection to the land and its important in theirs in community life, as well as the significance of storytelling so that future generations learn and understand the way of life of ancestors, of parents and grandparents, and ultimately of a culture. The stories shared by the women, the way they worked, the way in which they participated in informing Southern Inuit life, history, and culture, reveal how their expressions of culture are essential to cultural survival. Today, they are not romantic still, they're practical. And so we thought, I think we continue to think that this is really interesting because even though the role of Inuit women in the society have been marginalized and minimalized to a large degree, that these women continue to be very active and certainly seem to be continue to be the culture carriers.
So this is all a bit about storytelling. So storytelling, I started off with talking about the sort of colonial narratives, the colonial storytelling, the stories that were told historically in the public domain. And we're talking about now storytelling used in very different ways, in some ways to counteract that, those sort of dominant historical narratives, but also to transcend them, to ignore them, to do it in a quite different way. So storytelling, as Amy said, as a way of creating community, as a way of creating cultural survival, a way of drawing people together, a way of including people. So in our next steps, we're working this summer on, again, storytelling, but trying to, in our understanding, our new understanding of the way that storytelling is used, we're trying to figure out ways to create spaces for that, to create opportunities for that sort of storytelling to happen. And so we are interested too in looking at the way that stories are used intergenerationally and to connect different generations and to connect different places. So we're going to delve into digital storytelling this summer and work with youth in Goose Bay making digital stories based on their discussions with older people and to create those opportunities for storytelling within generations, between generations. Should we get into more? Okay. So we'll end there. Just thank you to the women of NunatuKavut who have been teaching us here at NunatuKavut Community Council and the Labrador Institute. Thank you.
Are you planning to publish something?
Actually, Mona, we're hoping that some of our digital stories can end up in the library.
Are you planning to publish writings or the digital stories? You mean that there'll be videos that you watch? Will there be writings? Are you publishing a book or?
That isn't in the, no, that isn't in the near future. We're writing together academically. From the stories, no, we're not talking about that. We are hoping though that the digital stories can be used, put in museums or used in some sort of educational.
Where they can be more widely accessible.
Yeah.
And the tourism market is telling us these days that people are more into digital stories in this frame, in this manner. I don't know, it's not my feeling for it.
I have a question about the historical research, because it seemed to me, and I mean, I remember bits and pieces of it, but a lot of the time, I thought you were talking about NunatuKavut.
Well, it's a lot of the same story, really.
Because when you talk about the Moravians and Nain and Lydia Campbell, that's what I think about. I don't think about NunatuKavut.
Yeah, well, they really started that using those definitions about what is Inuit and what's not. So what they said from Northern Labrador really had an impact on the rest of Labrador. So they were,
Who said?
the Moravians.
Oh, yeah.
When they were talking about
Yes.
Southlanders and they used all different sorts of names for people who didn't live within the Moravian settlements. And even people who did live in the Moravian settlements.
Had an impact on the southern community.
Had impact on the idea of who was seen publicly as Inuit and who wasn't.
As what Andrea mentioned, right, there were economic reasons to dispossess Indigenous people from their lands. And certainly the Moravians were very thorough and detailed record keepers.
Yes.
Of,
I have lots of knowledge about the
Yeah.
Moravians, but I don't know about their knowledge in southern Labrador.
well, the fact that they were confined to specific regions, fairly in northern Labrador more so, meant that when people come to a region and are solely interested in fishery and interested in economic gain from a region, they're less inclined to discuss things like culture, and they're not interested in who these people are. And so a lot of the historical record was not transmitted, and it was not written. Interestingly enough, there are historical records that detail history and events that took place, like the treaty, to my knowledge, the only Inuit treaty in the country, took place in Chateau Bay, which is even more south than my community. So, these pieces of history didn't make it, didn't qualify into the books for reasons.
And I think the Moravians, because obviously they did talk about mostly about the people who were living with them or around them, but in saying that these people were the only true Inuit, by default silenced, erased everyone else.
Because I know they also tried to set up a congregation in Riglet, in the Riglet area,
Yeah.
and they didn't succeed.
Yeah.
And that's why there's still very few people that can speak the Riglet dialect of Inuktitut without German
Yeah.
influence.
Yeah.
So that was one question I had, but also the quotes from Lydia Campbell. Like I said, I think that she's a Southern Inuit. Maybe I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, well, I just mean she's talking about the marriages between Europeans marrying Inuit, and just that in general.
Do you have any historical research from Southern Labrador with in cases similar or any historical research?
No, the work that, Lisa Rank and,
Yes.
yeah.
Similar
And
that, yeah.
all that, yeah. Yeah, that's, I'd say, the Greg's work, Greg Mitchell's work.
Okay, thank you.
Would you want to publish some of your stories and memories?
Yeah, the women's issue.
Yeah.
This is all. Yeah. It's, yeah, well, we are talking, Amy's planning an issue for spring, I guess, 2017 about Labrador women
Yeah.
in, Panama, Labrador. So, yeah, somebody's will go into that. Along with women from elsewhere, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She told me about it, but I just had the issue to it up here.
Yeah. Leading questions. Are there any other questions?
I was just interested in when you were talking about the difficulty that a lot of these women had in the identifying or self-identifying with the political labeling that was going on. Could you talk more about how they were addressing that when you were?
Well, I can tell you from my own experience, because we didn't push the idea when it was brought up in conversation. In some cases, simply irrelevant to people. But I have a friend, me and a friend of mine from Hopedale and another friend of mine from Maine had this discussion when we were all living in St. John's at the same time. And we talked about how these labels were not necessary until we moved away from our communities. And we were introduced into another society that really depended on categorizing and boxing us into these labels to understand, okay, who you are in relation to this person, or who you are in relation to this community. And so I can really only speak to my own experience in that. And of course, I mean, when you think about living on the coast as opposed to a more urban region, in many ways, like my community is still very much dependent upon hunting and fishing for subsistence. So lives are very practical, and the things you do are very practical, and they're not based in luxury or all these other things. And so I think that also has implications for time. You have time to sit back and reflect on the politicization of what's going on in this outside world that's not really touching you on a day-to-day level. And to a large degree, I think that's what's happened with the silencing of stories over the years as well, that those women were invested in their communities and playing a role in their communities and meant the difference between life and death in a lot of cases. So the idea that someday down the road an Indigenous nation would be erased from the picture wasn't really like an aha moment at the time. It's something that the more privileged, like I, get to see and sit down and reflect on.
Thanks.
Any more questions?
No, I had something to, I forget my train of thought. That was a good question. It's an important question, right? Because we become so consumed and entrenched with the idea of labels and having to identify that we forget that these labels only become necessary anyway. Like in the Labrador case, like it's arbitrary. It's based on something as arbitrary as political boundaries that come between defining who you are. And so it's very interesting.
A lot of people are just too busy to think about it.
Yeah.
Amy, it's nice to hear you say you're NunatuKavut in more of the way that the Inuit elders have said that is more of the correct pronunciation.
I tell people that, but then they just kind of tell me, no, yeah, well, it's the way I was taught. But I also recognize that, as you said, with regards to the regular dialect, for example, that dialects change, and so it's hard for me to, like, well, you're not pronouncing this right. I mean, dialects are just so different.
Well, it's hard when that's how it came out. From the beginning was NunatuKavut, so I mean, it's hard for everyone to just
Yeah.
go back to
Yeah.
something different. But I know that I've been told by elders that elders to them have said that that's more.
Yeah.
what he's saying.
All right, well, there's no more questions. Thank you guys, but feel free to stick around and chat. There's coffee and tea and cookies and fig Newtons, I think, so. I don't like fig Newtons, so feel free to eat all of those. There's a cookie left over. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Amy and Andrea and Sylvia.